History. History always is, at best, like this story, a chiaroscuro. The 23 Club by Edward Flaherty. Episode 6, Rub Al Khali, Inland. Part 1. Desert Sirens. If there could be a Twilight Zone or an X-Files event on this trip, this next area would be the setting. Chalmers and Jean-Claude appeared to leave contact with civilization behind when they took the Hamim turnoff south. There was no other traffic. The road was well asphalted, 2 lanes, 1 in each direction, and 2 full asphalt shoulders. The verges on each side had the Sheikh Zayed tree plantations, as always, laid out linearly in agricultural fashion. These trees were young, in their first 2 or 3 years. More noteworthy, though, was the desert. It was stirred, riled, mad with the wind. Reduced visibility now limited their maximum speed to less than 70 kilometers per hour. Jean-Claude said, "Over nearly a year, when I was regularly making this trip, I may have only seen 2 or 3 shamal storms like this one. Most of the time, I could enjoy the alluring forms of these dunes. On each dune, your eyes could discover feminine curves. The feminine curves that throughout time have melted man's intelligence, where the turn of the waist sweeps into the hip, and the hip line so gracefully slides into the thigh, and on, from every angle to every eye, these timeless curves call out from each dune like a siren to Odysseus. No, stronger still the call. From the dune landscape is a harem of siren calls, each beautiful, sweet, alluring, all promising exquisite satisfactions." Okay, steady on, Jean-Claude. Chalmers butted in before Jean-Claude got carried away any further. "Pull back a bit, because we have a real weather event today. The desert is threatening like the wildest ocean storm. The wind is whipping, scrambling the landscape like a roaring hurricane, but without rain, without humidity, just furious wind, furious sand." The sun was a dim disk, by the storm nearly blotted out of the sky. Their visibility was reduced to less than 200 meters, and the sand was swirling, drifting, dancing, and racing over the asphalt. As they drove on, the previous mini-dunes of the Subka coast grew larger, and each dune had a roaring top being forcefully reshaped by the relentless shamal wind. After driving with buffeting winds and poor visibility for an arduous 70 kilometers, they came to the first paved intersection of sorts. It had signs for oil and gas rigs, a Saab to the west, and a sign for Safi el-Nar in the direction of the Saudi and Omani borders, 34 kilometers to the east. They could see, just by the side of the road, a small 1-story white stucco building. Stopped in front of the building on the road shoulder were 7 or 8 large, heavy-duty construction hauling trucks, their warning blinkers flashing because of the sandstorm poor visibility. Chalmers and Jean-Claude stopped too. Part 2. Lunch on the Spice Route. The building was a truck stop, and its name was the Hawatine Restaurant. Chalmers and Jean-Claude were happy to be inside, away from the storm. The cheaply built structure housing the restaurant cum snack shop was about 6 meters wide by 15 meters long. It was not particularly well lighted, a line of single fluorescent tubes strung across the length of the ceiling, the weak lighting exaggerated by darkness from the sandstorm outside. At the front door, behind a small counter, sat an attendant and 2 coolers, candy bars, pop, and water in the coolers, potato chips and other dry, pre-packaged nibble stuff at the counter. On the far end, a small, open kitchen was steaming with the first meal of the day, large pots over gas fires tended by a cook and a helper. In the center were 8 small 1 meter by 1 meter tables for eating, with 4 chairs each. Only 2 tables were free. The guys already eating all had traditional Pakistani clothes, loose-fitting cotton shalwar kameez, either white or beige color. Chalmers called them pakjamas, because they looked like pajamas. But actually they were quite effective and efficient clothes for the salary, the climate, and the work involved. It was nearing 11 a.m. They had left without any breakfast, so for 8 dirhams each, they sat down at one of the empty tables to biryani and chai latte. Immediately the cook's helper brought out 2 huge plates of steaming hot, freshly made chicken biryani. As Chalmers started to tuck into his biryani, Jean-Claude commented that this restaurant wasn't here 5 years ago. Then Jean-Claude noted in some places this biryani could have been served as one big bowl of mush, but see how the biryani has been layered, starting with a thick, solid bed of basmati rice covered with a layer of thicker biryani sauce. Then a smaller layer of basmati rice shaped like an inverted bowl, all topped with another scoop of the sauce. This has been prepared by a person who takes pride in the cooking and presentation. Look at how he has decoratively placed a bay leaf on the top of it all. In between spoonfuls, Chalmers tried to identify the component spices in the biryani aroma. Cardamom, cumin, cloves. Even today, the historical traces of the spice route resonate in the local cuisine. This was the spice route, right? Jean-Claude recalled, "You're right, it was. I'm sure you remember the so-called spice route. Had many paths. Coming from the Far East, one bounced along all the ports of the southern Arabian Peninsula, then to East Africa, or to the Red Sea, Cairo, the Med. Another turned up and through the Strait of Hormuz. All were always in contact with what we today call the United Arab Emirates." Cardamom, cumin, cloves, he continued. They are common in the marketplace and in restaurants here as spices, likely some of the pervasive first aromas that will distinguish any store, street, or restaurant in the UAE as exotic to a first-time Western visitor. Cardamom from the ginger family came originally from the subcontinent. Elitaria cardamomum is an herbaceous perennial, with all parts heavily aromatic, but commercially these days this green cardamom may be coming from Central America. Cloves, one of the originals long ago from the Spice Islands in Indonesia, and now the subcontinent. Syzygium aromaticum comes from an evergreen smallish tree, but neither one of these, cloves or cardamom, can grow nicely in this climate. Chalmers, already well and truly into his biryani, found the sauce was highly spiced, curry-like, with potatoes and onions dominating, with just enough bits of chicken and pleasantly sweetened by a couple small pieces of chopped dates. It didn't take long for either of them to finish. After draining his little 6-ounce thin plastic cup of chai latte, Chalmers asked, "Except the 2 over there with messy red hair and red beards, most of these Pakistani truck drivers eating here have big, bushy black beards. Among the Arabs, a big bushy beard and a short thobe most dependably denote fundamentalist leanings, Wahhabi tendencies. Is it the same with these guys?" Jean-Claude chuckled. No. Big, bushy beards are just manly. It may be likely that they are Shia, if anything. I noticed at least one black cloth tied to a side view mirror on one of the trucks, a common sign that the driver is Shia. Oh, and the ones with red hair? Those are Pashtuns, Afghans, many of whom traditionally henna their hair and beards. Jean-Claude continued, "These guys, they're living their dream, Chalmers. They are here driving big diesels, Mercedes, Volvo, huge trucks. If they are lucky, even a heavy-duty Kenworth. You'll see some of them wearing NASCAR caps. Even some of the Emiratis wear NASCAR caps with their kanduras. Among Muslims, the diversity of belief and culture is very broad. Chalmers said, I've done a fair amount of reading, and isn't it funny how all the Muslims seem to get easily lumped together into one anonymous group, when in reality they have continuously evolving internal strife regarding interpretations of what Islam does or does not include. Disputes argued in detail, tracking back centuries with references and interpretations. What to speak of these contemporary pop culture overlays like NASCAR? Jean-Claude advised. But even an appreciation of that diversity and the deeply historical internal squabbling should not reduce, I repeat, should not reduce the Western world wariness regarding the rise and presence of Muslim faithful in their countries. So, Chalmers asked, you too see this new politically correct tolerance in the West as a weakness that could be exploited in the centuries-old battle between Muslims and Christians? Why not, Chalmers? Read the Koran. And after all, who has the water and who has the fertile land? When Jean-Claude finished his chai latte, they both got up and went to the counter to pay. While paying, each bought a mishwak, and smiling and satisfied, noted that the toothbrush cost just about as much as the lunch itself. They were ready to go. But as Jean-Claude and Chalmers stepped outside again, the ripping, wind-blown sand savagely scoured their faces, their necks, and any exposed skin. Getting back inside their vehicle was a huge relief. They paused to imagine what the experience of this storm would have been had they been traveling only by foot or camel. Unimaginable. How does one hunker down in this kind of debilitating sandstorm? How can one find shelter to outlast these storms of 12 to 72 hours? They pushed on. The trip was taking much longer than they had calculated. They continued toward Hamim. The young trees on the roadside were bending over, taking it, overwhelmed by this raging sandstorm. Sand was drifting right through the plantations to the road edge, over the road, everywhere. Chalmers asked, Jean-Claude, you said you saw 2 or 3 storms like this before. It looks like these roads will have to be plowed or swept. If not, a couple storms like this and the road would just disappear. Depends on how long the storm lasts, Chalmers. Sometimes after a short shamal out of the northwest, the weather changes, and a system establishes the secondary prevailing wind out of the southeast for a couple of days, and that will clean up a lot of it. Other times, I've seen maintenance work done by front-end loaders and trucks in order to keep the right-of-way clear. They do what has to be done to keep the road open. Buffeting, drifting, kilometer after kilometer, the same continued. Buffeting, drifting. Part 3. Tropic of Cancer. It was a push, but Chalmers and Jean-Claude drove on. In a wild weather landscape, they crossed the Tropic of Cancer, an imaginary line, noteworthy only as an intellectual exercise on their GPS. No signs, no markings, commented Chalmers. Jean-Claude clarified. I am sure you know, Chalmers, the geodesy and survey science behind the location. The position of the Tropic of Cancer is not fixed. Its position varies in a very complicated manner over time. It is one of those measurements that when the science behind it is unbundled, the uncertainties and anomalies in our understanding of planetary movement are laid bare. An hour into this part of the trip, there seemed to be a lessening of the wind. The sand looked more a golden orange than taupe, and the dunes were certainly higher. The signpost read, 5 kilometers to Hamim. As the road bent to the west and descended, they saw in the distance the outlines of the fodder and date palm plantations, hints of the irrigated valley of Hamim. They were about to reach the eastern end of the Liwa oasis. Jean-Claude shared one legend about the Liwa oasis and the tribe who inhabit it, and most of the Abu Dhabi Emirate, the Bani Yas. He explained, "The naming structure among the tribes is quite important. Descendants from a famous man who has proven himself wise and strong respect him by highlighting his name in their lineage when they give their own name. Emiratis listen quite closely to introductions from other Emiratis, because this structured name lineage tells about an individual's heritage, ethics, and current potential, all in one." He told Chalmers an example. The legend goes that a certain man named Yaz was the first to dig a well and assure dependable water in the Liwa oasis. The importance of this remains clear centuries later, as an entire very large tribe is known as the people of Yaz, the Bani Yaz. Jean-Claude shared further, "The wells in each and every valley of this Liwa oasis have been slowly established by trial and error over time. Even as little as 200 meters between wells can make the difference in the water suitability for agriculture. The residents take relatively sweet water from the first 25-meter depth to grow fodder for camels and goats, and minimal subsistence when the season permits, and especially date palms. And Chalmers, you might be interested to know that they grow some really nice date varieties, Khalas, Buman, Al-Nukba. Which reminds me, about 4 or 5 years ago, I visited a Liwa date festival in Mazira. The main event at the festival was a date competition. The competition was according to variety, for the combined best-looking and best-tasting Ritab dates. Ritab dates are half ripe. They have not been dried. They are different from what we always see in the stores, the Timur, or fully ripe, which have always been cut and dried for a time as part of the full ripening process. For Ritab, one half is so very light, moist, tender, it has a melt-in-your-mouth sweetness, while the other half, the stem half of the date, is not yet ripe. It is a crunchy, fibrous texture, and like a green banana, not sweet at all in taste." Chalmers asked, "Would those Ritab dates be in texture like the soft, large, and expensive medjool dates, often found in boutique grocery stores around the world?" No, Chalmers, not at all. Those are Timur. These Liwa oasis Ritab were soft as warm butter, and their sweetness, beyond words. Let me continue, Chalmers, please. The competition presentation required that the Ritab dates be displayed in baskets woven in patterns using date palm frond leaflets. Very basic, very fundamental. The presentations were resilient with a humble farmer pride. It was fun, an excellent exhibition of agriculture and craft skills, all by Liwa Emiratis. I saw it as a demonstration that even under these incredibly harsh environmental conditions, the residents proudly shared an ethno-botanical pride. Jean-Claude, I never heard of anything about that, or any Emirati ethnobotany, during my 2 years on the Atlantis project in Dubai. There, on that project, the intent was to build a stage set, a place to overwhelm guests, a fantasy land, the entire opposite to your date festival. Ours was a place to suspend disbelief, and it worked for that. But Jean-Claude, I need to make a point here. I have some doubts. This shared ethnobotanical route is difficult. On the one hand, if it truly is part of an historically shared pride, I can see its value, its almost essential presence, not to be lost. But, Jean-Claude, suggested Chalmers, sometimes I wonder if this idea of communicating ethnobotanical heritage through contemporary landscape design is a bit too much of a stretch. With a kind of nasty commercial exploitation, where it can easily turn into a Disneyland recollection. Or worse still, there can be a co-opting of the ethnobotanical tradition for a flim-flam sales pitch for approval. And regarding garden and landscape heritage, Jean-Claude, don't you find it strange, putting humans aside, how the landscape itself has its own ways of visually erasing the past, replacing the past simply with the passage of time? Jean-Claude replied, "Look, Chalmers, somebody has to bring that ethnobotanical knowledge in history to the table in landscape discussions, at least for consideration. If not, then public realm landscaping and associated gardens would become just another appliqué, nothing more than just another fashion, just a piece of throwaway costume jewelry, showing no respect for other life forms sharing this strange experience of life with us on this planet we call Earth. We do owe some respect, in my opinion." Chalmers mused. "But isn't it also silly, even absurd, to try to freeze-frame an historical garden or landscape? To make a garden like a museum exhibit, when the essence of all plant growth is change over time? Sometimes it seems to me that costume jewelry, temporary, throwaway, that is all it is, and maybe that is right. It is already a significant sign of affluence when we cannot have any worry for subsistence and plant only for beauty." The dunes along the roadside had become quite a bit larger, showing stronger reds. Visibility into the landscape had improved, and the wind continued to weaken. After much uncertainty, much rough treatment by the empty quarter landscape, they had finally arrived at Hamim. Part 4. Hamim. An oasis without romance. Hamim was barely an agricultural town, really just an agricultural village. Everything looked rough. Sitting in a subka valley, Hamim, surrounded by dunes and filled with scruffy-looking date palm orchards, had about 20 simple, white, one-story, recently government-constructed houses, a mosque, a feed store, a grocery store with restaurant, and a gas station. That was it. That was all. Chalmers and Jean-Claude filled up at the gas station. The gas station. No modern 7-Eleven out here. No snacks. Toilet out back. They were in the Southwest American boondocks, early 1950s style. Not far from the gas station, on the roadside, about 100 meters away, they found the CTF Liwa Kasar project construction panel sign, which marked the final turn to access the project. "Well, Jean-Claude," Chalmers started, "this is where we both begin a road previously traveled by neither of us." "Not only that," Jean-Claude added, as they turned off the main road, "it looks like it will no longer be paved." He slowed down, shifted the Land Cruiser into four-wheel drive, and began their new direction on their last leg due south into the empty quarter. To reach the Liwa Kasar project destination, they still had to go another 12 or so kilometers. But from now on, it would be via a compacted, soft, gatch material, construction haul road, a very heavily used dusty road which was constantly being wetted down and recompacted by large construction water tankers. Right at the entry, they passed a huge pumping station and its auxiliary buildings, certainly for potable water. Along the haul road was an ongoing parallel excavation and installation of underground electrical supply cables being fed from trailers on which sat coiled cable on huge wooden spools. These were the permanent main electrical supply cables for the project. Lots of activity happening everywhere. Carefully they pushed on. The construction road was barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass. Heavy road graders were working behind the water trucks to make sure the road had no ruts, to make sure the sand dunes did not reclaim the road. Progress forward was slow. The Gatch construction road wound around huge dunes, separated by undeveloped dune subka valleys. In all the twisting and turning, they lost count of the dunes, but they did notice a distinct lessening of the wind. With the lessening of the wind, The visibility gradually improved. Winding around and through yet one more series of dunes, Jean-Claude noticed. "Chalmers, what is that, down in that valley on the left?" Chalmers looked. "That looks like a labor camp. Looks like 40-foot containers. Maybe a couple hundred of them. Each has windows in the sides, and each window has an air conditioner. No additional shade at all. Yeah, that's a labor camp." Once they passed the project labor camp and rounded one more huge dune, they reached the project's security gate. There was a barrier across the road, a temporary hut, and what looked like a team of 4 or 5 security guards opening and closing the barrier. There was a scrum of trucks of all sizes and purposes. The roadside was temporary parking anarchy. Both entering and leaving, every vehicle's driver had to stop, get out of the vehicle and go inside the hut to exchange passes and IDs. Trying to get in, there was a swarm of men outside the door to the hut, rustling with others trying to get out. The security guards did not have control on this day. Chalmers showed a guard the CTF pass given to him by Toons. The guard checked and noted the license plate number, BKV 974, then waved him through. Chalmers and Jean-Claude had escaped that mashup. They continued on, and passing around another large dune, they finally saw the construction site. Part 5. Destination 5-star. It might as well have been a big-budget movie set. The site was bustling. On the east end of the huge dune-truncated valley, the Liwa-Kasar building construction was shaped like a large horseshoe, opening to the west. Sitting well above the valley floor, the stepped buildings comprising the horseshoe shape were tucked into lower dune side slopes. The tallest and steepest dune was immediately on the right, the north side, and in full view from the construction. The dune dominated this end of the valley. This huge dune rose steeply 300 meters up from the Subka valley floor. This empty quarter landscape setting and well-blended buildings reminded Chalmers a bit of southern Morocco, where the Dra and Todra rivers descend from the Atlas Mountains into the Sahara Desert. In the Moroccan town of Ouarzazate, the Tawarit Kasbah was the most often photographed Atlas Kasar town. Perhaps a bit more high-rise, perhaps a bit more compact than this new project. Both of them, the Ouarzazate Kasar and this Liwa Kasar, by their form and substantial ramparts, provided protection. But here, unlike southern Morocco, there were no rivers in the valleys. Here, there was complete absence of surface water, absence of palms, absence of trees, absence of any noticeable green, any recognizable plants. With thousands of laborers at work, the 150-room hotel and 50 villas were in the peak of construction activity, but still mostly without finishes. In a small section of the taller construction, a specialist theming, plaster subcontractor was putting on samples of the final finish, capturing the hue, the value, and the texture of the surrounding sands. They had completed enough of a sample to enable Chalmers and Jean-Claude to imagine the final look. The sample blended in nicely. The hotel main entry was obvious, because it was the only 4- and 5-story structure. It gently then stepped down into attached 3 stories and then 2 stories. The hotel and all villas were surrounded and protected by Kasar walls, massive ramparts clearly defining outside the desert from inside the residences and gardens. Overall, the visual image, the details, were traditional Kasar fashion, crenellated tops and edges, stepping down the side slopes of the dunes, buttressing the lowest levels. By now, the wind had significantly relented, and they could see fairly well. They found a place free from the hubbub of site construction activities to pull over and pause, to look out over and down the valley. The calmer wind permitted them to look out into the huge dune landscape, using a different magnification, a stronger lens on the Subka Valley and the extensive sweeping dunes framing it. During the construction process, this stunning natural valley had been protected. It was clear why the site was chosen and why the buildings had been placed where they were. The composition and grandeur of this large landscape of valley, dunes, and sky could only be done justice by a photographer with the vision and skills of Ansel Adams, or a cinematographer like David Lean's Freddie Young. That was the view, being protected for all guests. The valley stretched and wriggled out for more than a kilometer, maybe 2. The windstorm no longer a factor, Chalmers and Jean-Claude climbed out of their SUV, looked carefully up the valley and dune landscape. They saw desert detail for the first time. The huge dunes in front of them stretched further than they could see, but they could see on closer inspection, sinuously sweeping over the valley floor, small, graceful, long and thin dune fingerlets, each only a meter or 2 high, that had been aligned by the opposing prevailing northwest and southeast winds. There was no flow line on the valley floor, just random depressions, shifting hollows, created by these ever-moving, slowly evolving serpentine dune fingerlets. Winds reshaped them, stills revealed their small scale, their transient beauty. On their surfaces could be read the transitory language of the fauna. Upon careful exploration, Jean-Claude and Chalmers, straining, could see on the gentle undulations of these red desert sand dune fingerlets, and in their hollows, growing, randomly, small fine-textured green mounds, most likely zygophyllum species, never taller than 50 centimeters high, scattered, discrete, sparsely, very sparsely distributed. They could be seen in various ages, from young to juvenile to mature to senile. Their entire life cycle was there to view, in one look. Jean-Claude had seen them before and added, regardless of the shifting sands, their taproots take advantage of the groundwater, up to 3 meters below the valley floor. Jean-Claude wanted to walk the valley. He was looking for desert roses and fire plants, Leptodenia pyrotechnica, rarely seen in the western region, 2 meters tall, loosely branched shrub clumps, often used for shelter by desert gazelles. And Chalmers? He was late and had to get started with his meetings. They found the site construction offices, parked their SUV, climbed out, then on foot went their own ways. Part 6. Transect Map. The following graphic images map the transect followed by Chalmers and Jean-Claude. They may help the reader to understand, or to at least picture, the difference between the Rub Al Khali coastal and the Rub Al Khali inland.